Hello, and welcome to my presentation on Bernstein's fourth Norton Lecture, The Delights and Dangers of Ambiguity. It's interesting to note that Bernstein starts this lecture with a brief political statement, especially in the context of the politically active Noam Chomsky, whose works have been used as a point of reference throughout this lecture series. Barry Seldis might suggest that Chomsky influences more than just the musical material that Bernstein presents here. But on to the meat of the lecture. Bernstein's meticulous preparation has already provided him with material to springboard us into this fourth lecture, as ambiguity was an important feature in the preceding three lectures. Now, having established the phonological, syntactical, and semantic relationship between language and music, Bernstein is ready to tackle the issue of ambiguity head-on in the fourth lecture of the series. Bernstein begins the heart of this lecture by defining ambiguity for us. He offers us two definitions. The first, doubtful or uncertain, we're going to shelve for a moment while we deal with the second definition he offers us, capable of being understood in two senses. This definition highlights a great deal of duality within music throughout what Bernstein terms as the Golden Age. From Bach to Beethoven, we have been dealing with the duality of symmetry, tonic and dominant relationships, upbeats and downbeats, and of course, diatonicism versus chromaticism. Bernstein uses an example from the Adagietto of Mahler's Fifth Symphony, which he plays for us on the piano. Let's give it a quick listen.
For instance, do you recognize these few bars?
This short example gives us several ambiguities to analyze. Although it's a simple dominant to tonic resolution, it is rhythmically ambiguous due to the harp vamp not providing us with a strong downbeat. This leaves us wondering what beat we're on and what meter we're in. Secondly, there's a harmonic ambiguity because we receive only a dyad. There's no third tone to define the triad. The A and C could leave us in A minor or F major. It's not until the bar of resolution where we finally receive the F, which gives us a clear tonality to lock onto. His final example of ambiguity returns us to the third lecture and Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. This is a semantic ambiguity. Beethoven's title and suggestion of non-musical birds and bees creates a conflict of meaning. With this, Bernstein has highlighted phonological ambiguity, what key are we in, syntactic ambiguity, what meter are we in, and semantic ambiguity. Is this pure music, or are there extra musical meanings? Now that we have returned to Beethoven, probably Bernstein's favorite composer, we can transition from the Golden Age into the heart of the 19th century. Beethoven is perfect for this because Bernstein sees him as both the last great classicist and the first great romantic composer. While he works within the strictures of classical structure, he breaks down barriers to greater freedom in formal structure, harmonic procedure, instrumental color, melody, and rhythm. With examples from Schumann and Chopin, he highlights the evolution of ambiguity as the constraints of classicism drop away. At this point, Bernstein offers us a question. Is more ambiguity more expressive and therefore better? Well, he gives us an interesting answer. He starts by telling us that it's a foolish question. And he says, I don't have to point out that it's not a question of better. These questions relate not to qualitative changes in art, but to quantitative changes. Of course Chopin is more chromatic than Mozart, but that doesn't make him a greater composer. We'll refer to this answer later in our analysis of the lecture, so keep it in mind. From here, Bernstein takes us on a brief poetic sidebar, leading us to his next point, the interaction of the arts in the Romantic Revolution. Bernstein claims that the arts begin to intermingle, which led to advancements across all forms of expression, from painting to literature, to, of course, music. From this revolution springs forth the music of Berlioz, with his specific programming. Bernstein tells us that of Berlioz's entire output, there is only one piece, a little violin piece, that does not have specific literary associations. Clearly, this is a great change in a small amount of time. As loath as Beethoven was to admit to tone painting, Berlioz clearly embraces it. Bernstein offers us an analysis of Romeo and Juliet, which further exemplifies the extra musical material hard at work in this symphony, as well as the harmonic, melodic, and rhythmic ambiguities which are so expressive in this piece. And that brings us to the close of the first section of this lecture. The remaining two sections are both extended musical examples. First, from Wagner's Tristan und Isolde, and second, from Debussy's Afternoon of the Faun. Let's briefly hit the highlights of these sections before we take Bernstein to task. And so here is Bernstein's analysis of Wagner's Tristan in brief. He begins by calling Wagner a transformational magician, not just because of the transformations that he does to his own music, but because Bernstein sees Tristan as an enormous transformation of Berlioz's Romeo. Secondly, he points out how Wagner exploits ambiguity in all three linguistic modes: phonological, syntactical, and semantic. Thirdly, he describes Tristan as one infinitely long series of transformations, or metaphor upon metaphor. And finally, he concludes by naming Tristan as the crisis work of the 19th century. In fact, he goes so far as to say, "It's almost as if the extreme chromaticism of this music, with its fiercely unappeased sensual desire, can no longer be contained in a tonal framework." From there, let's move to Debussy's Afternoon of a Faun. The development of this piece is based upon the tritone and the whole tone scale. In spite of this, Bernstein insists that it's still a masterpiece of structure because these devices are strictly contained. He concludes by calling this the first organized atonal material. It is still contained by tonal fences, however, because we still reach strong transitional and cadential points where we firmly arrive in E major. So at this point, I've spent nearly 8 minutes going over this Bernstein lecture. And where has he left us? Well, we started with Beethoven in the Golden Age, and we made our way through Berlioz, Wagner, and Debussy, and we watched the definition of ambiguity change. We started in the Golden Age with the ambiguity of duality, and by the time we reached Debussy, we were pretty firmly rooted in the doubtful or uncertain definition. Not a lot of duality going on anymore. We've also established that ambiguity is necessary for poetic meaning and musical metaphor, and that an increase in ambiguity can increase the affect of music. Further, we've established that ambiguity can be dangerous when it loses all containment, and I think Bernstein is clearly headed here in the next lecture, the 20th Century Crisis. I'm excited to see where he goes. What criticisms did I have? Well, I'm not sure why we had the first 3 lectures at all. I think it's pretty easy to jump into this lecture without building that whole analogy between music and language. I'm not sure what we achieved with that. Maybe that's because I already understand Bernstein's musical jargon, and maybe that's more essential for the layman who doesn't already have a degree 2 or 3 in music. My other problems with this lecture were pretty small. There was a Wagner transformation that Bernstein glossed over on page 236. I tried to figure out how he did it, didn't get anywhere on my own. So I wish he would have provided a reference or just a little more information to deal with that. And my other problem was when Bernstein talked about the Romantic Revolution. He says, and I quote, "It's as though the arts became more interested in one another, as did the artists themselves." I think he's misrepresenting the situation a little bit here. I think that the arts and artists have been interested in each other throughout all of art's history. However, at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, there was a big advancement in the printing press, and paper got really cheap. And journals and newspapers started to be published widely, and it became very easy to get a hold of books. And I think that this is the main reason that the arts were able to interact in this new way. Not because they got more interested in each other, but because the information was just a lot more accessible. It's a minor point, really, but one of the only ones that I could come up with in this chapter because I think it's pretty awesome. Oh, and do you remember that foolish question we asked earlier? I think Bernstein was intentionally leading us astray. The question isn't foolish, it's just phrased poorly. More ambiguity isn't better. More ambiguity is dangerous. Not because ambiguity isn't expressive, but because you can always reach that point where ambiguity overwhelms meaning and all you have left is doubt and uncertainty. At any rate, I'm looking forward to the next lecture, and I'll see y'all in class.